The Arizona sun blazed mercilessly across the parched landscape as Ezra Doc Whitman stumbled through the desert thorns, his surgeon's hands mangled and useless, his medical bag torn and scattered across the rocky ground behind him. At 59, the former Army surgeon had saved countless lives on 3 different frontiers, from the muddy battlefields of the Civil War to the isolated forts of the Great Plains, and finally, the rugged settlements of the Arizona Territory. His hands had performed miracles with scalpel and suture when other doctors had declared cases hopeless. For 28 years, he had brought healing to the wounded territories, working tirelessly in conditions that would have broken lesser physicians. But he'd never expected to be tortured and left for dead by his own medical partner, betrayed for the crime of refusing to falsify death certificates that would cover up a smallpox epidemic deliberately spread among Apache reservations. "You're too ethical for frontier medicine, doctor," Samuel Crane had sneered, his Harvard-educated voice dripping with contempt as his hired thugs held Ezra down against his own examination table. The irony wasn't lost on Ezra as they crushed his fingers methodically with a bone saw he had used just days earlier to save a rancher's leg. This territory's got no use for physicians who can't tell the difference between medical practice and political necessity. Each crack of bone had been accompanied by Crane's lecture on frontier pragmatism, as if breaking a man's hands were merely an unfortunate lesson in territorial politics. The pain had been excruciating, but Ezra had refused to scream, denying Crane the satisfaction, even as darkness threatened to claim his consciousness. The political necessity had been Crane's elaborate scheme, developed in partnership with territorial officials whose land speculation depended on clearing Apache families from valuable mining and grazing territories. They had systematically introduced infected blankets to the reservations, a tactic borrowed from earlier frontier conflicts, then meticulously covered up the resulting deaths as natural causes to avoid federal investigation. The smallpox had spread rapidly through the crowded conditions, claiming primarily children and elders whose bodies couldn't fight the deliberate infection. When Ezra discovered the genocide, finding the warehouse where the infected materials were stored before distribution, and threatened to report it to Washington, Crane had decided that a tragic accident would solve his problem permanently. The decision had been made with the same clinical detachment with which he diagnosed terminal patients. "Should have stuck to treating bullet wounds instead of treating conscience," Crane had laughed, his perfectly manicured hands adjusting his silk waistcoat as they loaded Ezra's broken body onto a supply wagon bound for nowhere. "Maybe the Scorpions will appreciate your medical ethics." The last thing Ezra remembered before losing consciousness was Crane's expensive cologne, a European fragrance that seemed obscenely out of place in the brutal reality of their surroundings. Now, 3 days later, Ezra crawled through the Palo Verde and Ocotillo, the desert plants tearing at his clothing, as if the landscape itself sought to finish what Crane had started. His ruined hands left bloody prints on the desert stones, marking his desperate path through the wilderness. His vision blurred from dehydration and the agony of shattered bones, each movement sending fresh waves of pain through his body. In the distance, he spotted adobe buildings clustered around what appeared to be a natural oasis, the first sign of human habitation he'd seen since crawling away from the arroyo where Crane's men had dumped him. The mission sat nestled in a hidden canyon, its walls providing blessed shade from the merciless sun. Date palms swayed gently in the occasional breeze, surrounding vegetable gardens that seemed impossible in this harsh landscape, a testament to human perseverance and the precious water that bubbled from a spring at the canyon's heart. With his last reserves of strength, Ezra collapsed at the chapel steps, his blood staining the worn stones that had been laid by Spanish missionaries generations earlier. The heavy wooden door opened with a creak. A woman in her mid-40s emerged, her black hair streaked with silver and pulled back in a practical bun. She wore the simple robes of a lay sister, and her dark eyes held the calm wisdom of someone who'd witnessed both the brutality and beauty of frontier life. "Madre de Dios," she breathed, immediately kneeling beside him. "What happened to you, doctor?" The fact that she recognized him as a physician, despite his current state, surprised Ezra through his pain-induced haze. He tried to lift his hands in explanation, but only managed a weak gesture toward the tattered remains of his medical bag. The woman, he'd later learn her name was Sister Catalina Vasquez, helped him inside without hesitation. Her small infirmary provided blessed relief from the brutal heat of the desert. The room was cool and well organized, with herbs hanging from the ceiling beams and shelves of carefully labeled medicines. "Your own partner did this?" she asked as she gently cleaned his wounds, examining his mangled hands with expertise that surprised him. Ezra nodded weakly, his voice barely a whisper. "Caught him. Poisoning. The Apache. Didn't appreciate my interference." Catalina's expression darkened with recognition. She'd seen this kind of systematic violence before, the calculated brutality of men who used medicine as a weapon rather than a tool of healing. "Monstros," she muttered. "Monsters who betray their sacred oath." For 8 long weeks, Ezra lay helpless while Catalina tended his wounds with remarkable skill. She combined frontier medicine with traditional remedies passed down through generations of curanderas in her mother's family. His hands would never fully heal. Too many bones had been shattered beyond repair, but under Catalina's persistent care, she managed to preserve enough function for him to hold simple instruments. When Ezra finally sat up clear-headed, he found Catalina treating a group of Apache children whose symptoms suggested measles. Their families had brought them secretly to the mission after the reservation's government-appointed doctor had refused to see them, claiming their ailments were merely the natural consequence of inferior constitution. Catalina worked with the skill of someone who'd learned medicine through necessity and compassion rather than formal training. "You're a healer," he observed from his sickbed, watching her gentle care of the sick children. "I'm whatever my people need me to be," Catalina replied without looking up from the child whose fever she was bathing with cool water. "Nurse, teacher, protector. God calls us to serve in many ways." Over the following weeks, as Ezra's strength gradually returned, and he began assisting Catalina in whatever limited capacity his damaged hands allowed, her story emerged in fragments shared during quiet evenings by the mission's hearth. Catalina had been raised in this very mission, the daughter of a prosperous Mexican rancher and his wife who had supported the church's work in the territory. Her father had been murdered by Anglo settlers seeking to steal his water rights, a common fate for Mexican landowners whose properties suddenly became desirable after annexation. Rather than flee to relatives in Sonora or marry for protection, she'd taken informal religious vows and dedicated her life to providing medical care to those the territorial government systematically ignored. Mexicans whose land grants were no longer honored, Apaches displaced by reservation policies, and anyone else deemed unworthy of proper treatment by the territory's official medical establishment. "Men think a Mexican woman can't understand medicine," she explained one evening as she organized her supplies with scientific precision. "They're wrong. We understand healing better than most. We've had to learn it to survive." In turn, Ezra told her about Crane's conspiracy, filling in the details of the systematic plan to eliminate Apache populations through disease rather than more visible military action. He described discovering the warehouse where the infected blankets were stored before distribution, the meticulous records Crane kept of deaths that were later falsified as natural causes, and the years of faithful service repaid with betrayal when Ezra refused to participate in the genocide. "This Dr. Crane," she said finally, "he thinks medicine is a weapon?" "He thinks I'm a fool for believing in the Hippocratic Oath," Ezra replied, the bitterness of betrayal still fresh despite the weeks that had passed. "Too naive to understand that healing is just another form of politics." "Maybe he's right about one thing," Catalina said, her tone thoughtful. "Maybe that kind of medicine is finished. Question is, what are you going to heal to replace it?" Their answer came unexpectedly when a cholera outbreak threatened to devastate the scattered settlements of southern Arizona the following spring. The territorial doctors, concentrated in Tucson and focused on wealthy patients, refused to treat Mexican and Indian patients, claiming limited resources and the need to prioritize valuable members of society. The disease spread rapidly through poor communities, carried by contaminated water sources and exacerbated by crowded living conditions. Ezra's medical knowledge, his understanding of germ theory still considered controversial in many medical circles, combined with Catalina's understanding of desert remedies and community health practices, allowed them to implement measures that contained the epidemic. They established quarantine protocols, distributed boiled water, and treated hundreds of patients that official medicine had abandoned to die. "You still know your calling," Catalina observed as they watched the last cholera patients recover under their care, the crisis finally abating after weeks of exhausting work. "No anatomy, no disease, know how to read the signs when something's wrong," Ezra replied, awkwardly gripping a stethoscope with his damaged hands. "Out here, that's still worth something." Word spread through the Arizona Territory about the mission at Widow's Canyon, named for the distinctive rock formation that marked its entrance. Stories circulated about Sister Catalina and the crippled doctor who could provide healing for anyone who needed it, regardless of race, religion, or ability to pay. They developed a reputation for near-miraculous recoveries that extended from the Colorado River to the New Mexico border. More importantly, they found in each other something they'd both thought lost forever: professional partnership based on shared values, common purpose in a territory that rewarded selfishness, and the deep love that comes from serving God together through the healing arts. The confrontation with Samuel Crane came 2 years later, on a scorching summer day when the canyon's shadows offered the only relief from the relentless heat. He arrived with territorial health officials and forged documents, his appearance as immaculate as ever, despite the frontier conditions. The documents he carried claimed Ezra was mentally incompetent due to his injuries and needed to be placed under Crane's medical supervision, a transparent attempt to silence a witness who could expose his crimes. "There's the old cripple," Crane announced with theatrical disdain, pointing at his former partner as if identifying a specimen for dissection. "Living in squalor with some Mexican nun. Probably doesn't even remember the difference between a scalpel and a butter knife anymore." Ezra stepped out of the mission's doorway into the sunlight, no longer the broken man Crane had tortured and abandoned in the desert. 2 years of hard work and purpose had strengthened his body, while finding his true calling had restored his spirit in ways that surprised even him. His hands were twisted and scarred, permanent reminders of Crane's brutality. But his mind was sharp and his dedication absolute. "Samuel," he said calmly, his voice carrying across the mission courtyard, "you're looking prosperous. The genocide business treating you well?" "Don't be ridiculous," Crane snapped. "I'm here on official territorial health business." "Official?" Catalina stepped out beside Ezra, a rifle cradled in her arms with the casual competence of someone who had learned to defend her home in a lawless territory. "Funny thing about that. I sent some letters to friends in Mexico City and Washington. Seems the federal government's been investigating reports of deliberate disease outbreaks." Crane's confidence visibly wavered. Crane's confidence visibly realized they'd been building a case against him for months. Catalina's connections throughout the Catholic Church had provided a network for gathering and transmitting evidence that territorial authorities couldn't suppress. "This is a setup," Crane sputtered, his hand moving instinctively toward the expensive pistol he carried beneath his tailored jacket. "No," came a new voice from the canyon entrance, deep and authoritative. "This is justice." Chief Geronimo emerged from the rocks with a dozen Apache warriors, their faces painted for war in patterns that carried spiritual significance beyond mere intimidation. They had been tracking Crane's movements since learning of his role in the reservation deaths. "You want to poison more children?" Geronimo called out in perfect English that surprised Crane's companions. "Try poisoning warriors instead." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, the tension palpable in the hot desert air. Crane's officials were outnumbered and outgunned, facing not just angry Apaches but the consequences of a conspiracy that had extended far beyond what most of them had realized. "This isn't over," Crane snarled, backing toward his horse with the desperate bravado of a man who still believed his connections would protect him. "Yes, it is," came another new voice as a federal marshal rode into the canyon, flanked by Army medical officers and territorial investigators. "Samuel Crane, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, medical malpractice, and crimes against humanity." Crane's empire of death crumbled quickly once federal authorities began examining his medical records and interviewing survivors. The investigation revealed that his conspiracy had reached far beyond the Apache reservations, involving the deliberate spread of disease among any population deemed inconvenient by territorial authorities seeking to consolidate land and resources. He died in federal prison 3 years later, still claiming he'd only been following orders. "Feel better?" Catalina asked as they watched the federal party disappear over the canyon rim, taking Crane into custody to face justice for his crimes. "Feel healed," Ezra replied, flexing his damaged hands around a medical instrument with the satisfaction of a craftsman who had reclaimed his trade despite grievous injury. "For the first time since they crippled me, I feel like I'm practicing real medicine again." Their partnership deepened in the years that followed, evolving into something more profound than professional collaboration. They established a medical mission that served the entire territory, providing healthcare, training for local healers, and advocacy for those the official medical establishment ignored or actively harmed. Their approach combined the best of Western medicine with traditional healing practices, creating a unique system that addressed both physical ailments and the spiritual needs of their diverse patients. The mission expanded gradually, adding a small hospital wing built from adobe bricks they made themselves, a training center where Catalina taught local women basic medical skills, and gardens where they grew both food and medicinal herbs. Their work attracted attention from progressive physicians in the East, who occasionally traveled west to learn their integrated approach to frontier medicine. "We make quite a team," Catalina observed one evening as they sat in their garden, watching the sunset paint the canyon walls in brilliant oranges and purples. "We make a hospital," Ezra corrected gently, taking her hand in his scarred one. "The kind that's built on healing rather than harming, on service rather than profit." At 61, Ezra Whitman was no longer the broken-down surgeon who'd been tortured and left for dead by a corrupt partner. He had become a true healer in the broadest sense, a protector of the innocent, a teacher of medical knowledge that combined traditions, and living proof that medicine was strongest when it served all people, rather than just the powerful. The desert that had nearly claimed his life had instead given him purpose, partnership, and the chance to practice medicine the way it was meant to be practiced, with compassion that transcended cultural boundaries, integrity that withstood corruption, and the understanding that healing was a sacred trust that transcended politics and prejudice. And Sister Catalina Vasquez had found something she'd thought impossible in the prejudiced territory. Not just love, but professional partnership with someone who saw her Mexican heritage as an asset rather than a liability, who understood that the greatest healing came from treating the whole person, not just their symptoms. Together, they'd carved out their own piece of the American dream in the hidden beauty of Arizona, proving that sometimes the people society discards become the ones who provide the most essential services. Their mission became a beacon of hope in the territory, Widow's Canyon Medical Mission, where healing and compassion went hand in hand, where patients were treated based on need rather than status or wealth. The stagecoaches still ran past their canyon, carrying passengers and mail across the expanding Southwest, but now they carried something else as well. The knowledge that there were still places where the Hippocratic Oath meant something, where broken hands could still heal broken hearts, and where two people who'd been written off by the world proved that the strongest medicine is administered with love, respect, and the unwavering belief that every life has value.